IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to another episode of All Things Policy. I'm your host Shrikrishna Upadhyaya, and today we're going to be talking about digital public infrastructure and G20 and how digital public infrastructure has become so important in the context of G20. So on August 19th, the outcome of the Digital Economy Working Group of the G20 ministerial meeting came out, and the G20 has decided to endorse the digital public infrastructure framework suggested by Indian government. This is historic because it's one of the first times and earlier time when we have seen DPI being endorsed at a multilateral level. So to talk about this this historic development, we have two people who were intimately involved in this process from the beginning to the conclusion. And welcoming my guests on the show today, first we have Keyzom, who's Head of Digital Programming at the UNDP Chief Digital Office. Welcome to All Things Policy, Keyzom.
Thank you so much for having me here.
And we also have Ritul Gaur, who is an India Innovation Course Fellow working with the Ministry of Electronics and IT, Government of India. Ritul has appeared on All Things Policy quite a few times. It's good to have you back, Ritul.
Thanks, Shri. I must say that I'm a fellow Takshashila person, so this is not new to me, but great to be back.
So let's jump right into it, right? Digital public infrastructure and G20. And this has been endorsed by the Digital Economy Working Group ministers, like I just pointed out. So I want to know from you, who were involved in this process, as to why this outcome is so special. Why should we all care about it? Why did the G20 also agree that digital public infrastructure is something that the world needs today?
Great question. And I have to say, I am a big fan of Takshashila. So thank you again for having me. The groundbreaking consensus on what is digital public infrastructure was a stupendous achievement under the India presidency with the collective participation and consensus of the G20. Now, this is significant because here digital public infrastructure is understood not just as technology, but also governance, and also the participation of community, whether it's innovators to civil society, that can really help extend service delivery and so on for people and planet. So in this sense, at least from the UN side, this is stupendous because digital public infrastructure can become surveillance state tools. And when you add layers of governance and safeguards and attention to that globally, it means that its opportunities to accelerate the sustainable development goals become tremendous.
Right. And I think you mentioned a lot of things which I would like to, dig a little bit deeper into as we progress through this conversation. But Ritul, you were involved in this negotiation process. You were in the room. I think there were 4 meetings which were held over the span of the last 1 year or so. So could you share whatever you can from your experience? How did the process of negotiation evolve? How did this consensus that Keyzom pointed out was built?
Thanks, Shri. Excellent explanation by Keyzom there. Let me just zoom out a little bit here and explain from the scratch that G20 is essentially an economic forum. Started in 1999 through the Asian financial crisis, and then in 2008 it was elevated to the leader level. And then there has been leader level summit every year, and it does not have a secretariat. So the presidency itself chairs and drives the agenda and ultimately moves to a declaration. And under the G20, there are 2 tracks. One is the Sherpa track and one is the finance track. Now, finance track has a history of some concrete work. Sherpa track is relatively a new one where different working groups are being added. So Digital Economy Working Group is one of the working groups under the Sherpa track. And to stress a bit on what is a Sherpa track. Sherpa is a prime minister or the leader's appointee, leader's person who manages the G20 work. Now, DEWG is across the G20 economies managed by the respective line ministries. So the digital ministries in the 20 countries. As it happens, MeitY is the nodal, MeitY Ministry of Electronics and IT, where I work, is the nodal ministry for DEWG. And the process looks like that once the presidency is handed to the next country, which is through the Troika system, the presidency brings out an issue note which highlights what are the priorities the upcoming presidency is going to pick. And as you would have seen, we in this presidency had digital public infrastructure, which also happens to be Government of India's flagship agenda. We had digital skilling and security in the digital economy as a key priority. Now, to talk about the negotiation, the first meeting, so before the first meeting, we do certain bilaterals where we actually talk to countries saying, hey, this is what we're going to talk about. What do you feel? We're excited to see you in the first meeting. So the first meeting, we actually introduced the agenda. The presidency gives out certain presentations, explainers, etc. So first meeting is all about warming up to the idea that what is going to be discussed. Here are the key points that are going to be discussed. Subsequently, in the second meeting, and in the run-up to the second meeting as well, we do a lot of bilaterals trying to help countries build on top of it. Subsequently, in the second meeting, there are more explainers based on the questions that we've received in the first version. And in the third, and even in the fag end of the second, but essentially in the third and the fourth meeting is when we actually negotiate the ministerial declaration line by line. So every nuance is picked by countries line by line. There, the declaration is up at display in the big room, and then the negotiation happens live. Now, to talk about the first experience of when we went digital public infrastructure was countries were a little taken aback that it's a new concept and they were reluctant to sort of discuss this and had some kind of skepticism. But as we progressed, there was a humongous effort from the Government of India side to drive this agenda. Left, right, center, different working groups, panels, side events, etc. were formalized to do this. And to sort of take you back to the first meeting, while we are preparing the issue note, parallelly, we are also working on the ministerial declaration. So ministerial declaration is an expansive document, which is essentially 2-3 pager of a declaration, and the rest is annex, which dwells into the details that are captured, because the ministerial declaration is essentially statements that will be agreed by the ministers. So there you'll see a lot of statements that say we recognize, we agree, we endorse. So that's the part which is by the ministers, signed by the ministers, and the rest of the annexures is about delving into the details of what has been agreed upon. So it was, to say the least, it was one amazing ride to be a part of and to have a front seat, to be part of intensive negotiations. And I think Keyzom can attest to it as well. And a lot of learnings throughout the journey. When we first started, we thought, okay, in the first meeting itself, everyone's going to agree to what we are saying. But we came back understanding that, hey, we need to zoom out and actually make it more palatable for the 20 countries to agree. So we had to come back and do our groundwork on actually making the documents more flexible. Every text we were saying from should, it became to can. So that's a journey that you have to travel. And then once after the second meeting, you have some broad consensus on countries have agreed to that we are actually happy to discuss this. And then the third and the fourth meeting is when the details are drilled through. So every line, countries have reservation about a certain word, countries have reservation about certain concepts. So in digital public infrastructure, we had open standards. So some countries feel okay about it, others don't feel okay about it. So the rest is the process of actually hammering on what details do we actually want our ministers to endorse. So that's the broad process. And ultimately, this working group meetings culminate into the ministerial declaration, which on the last day of the fourth meeting is attested by the ministers, where ministers come and talk about what they view this achievement is. So it's the bureaucrats doing all the work that is required in the declaration, and then ministers coming and endorsing it.
Thank you for elaborating the whole process, and I'm sure the fruits of it must have been worth it when ultimately the ministerial declaration endorsed the DPI, so to say. And congratulations to both of you and to India as well, because this is now a key part of the G20. We hope that is going to be a key part of G20's agenda as we move forward. But I want to know from you, given India's experience and India is proposing a DPI at a world level, having had quite a bit of experience in developing DPI for its own use here domestically, domestically. And this started a decade or so ago when India built the identity stack, which we have Aadhaar, which almost every Indian resident has today. And this has evolved over time. So I want to know from you, Keyzom, how has the Indian experience sort of helped UN, UNDP, and all the other international organizations sort of mold their own perspective on what DPI should be and how it could be, and what are, say, the alignment or like differences with the Indian approach?
So India for us has been a learning lab because everything has been done at population scale, and everything has also been done with a very whole of society engagement where different government departments to innovators to the private sector to the startups to civil society are engaged. And we believe that this process of building digital public infrastructure, while you can get the technology right, getting also the policies, the capacities, and bridging that last mile inclusion are some key learnings that we take from India. Now, as we study and learn from India's journey, we are also seeing that this way of approaching this need for public rails or public infrastructure in software is also being tried and tested in countries like Brazil, in Estonia, in Thailand, in Togo. So as you can see, I'm naming global south and north countries. Digital public infrastructure has no real sort of boundaries in terms of who it's for. What we know is that, like internet, which many people mistook as, one of these channels along with radio, TV, and so on, was really an all channels for, radio, TV, and so on. And similarly, this is also the way in which we at the UN see digital public infrastructure or the digital public infrastructure advantage, whether it's climate goals, whether it's facilitating access to justice, whether it's health and well-being outcomes. There are a number of systems and databases and so on, and innovations even. And unless they are better integrated, better interacting, the service delivery or the lives that you can improve or make it easier, not only just for people like you and me and Ritul, but also for those that are smallholder farmers, that are kirana shop owners, and so on. I think those are sort of the key lessons and models that we take from India.
But let's actually spend a couple of minutes talking about this terminology DPI itself, right? I was just going through the ministerial declaration, and in fact, the very second line on DPI carves out an exception. It says, DPI is an evolving concept. Countries are free to use different terminology if it suits their context or make modifications or adaptations to DPI as such. So I want to know from you, at what level there exists a consensus on DPI, or what are sort of like the differences between the countries? Why, or do you think, are you fine with it being an evolving concept so that over the years we have a more concrete consensus, so to speak, on DPI itself between our different nations?
So I think consensus building is important. And, what happened at the G20 level certainly is very helpful for us at the UN as we take forward the Global Digital Compact and its adoption next year during the Summit of the Future at the UN. So certainly this consensus building among 20 plus the guest countries that India invited really helps us. Now, of course, consensus sometimes does dilute meaning, and often, as at least as UNDP, we have been brought into a number of conversations where there are different definitions of digital public infrastructure. And I've been pretty clear in saying that, the UN is not here to define what is digital public infrastructure. Each country and context is, whether you're Pacific Island countries to countries as big as Bangladesh, our neighbor here in South Asia, is going to determine what kind of an approach it takes. But there are some common minimums. Common minimums include the openness, the interoperability, with the building on open standards. And I think those are good governance. Those common minimums, I think, are really important to articulate in the sort of consensus building around digital public infrastructure.
Right. And I believe that is why the framework which is proposed in the ministerial declaration also goes into these ideas of technology, governance, and community that needs to underscore all sorts of DPI, and it also enlists several principles based on which different countries can develop and deploy DPI. But to just sort of like put this in context, I want to hear from both of you as to how you see DPI, which is being, built by countries or built by states and some places, in other places by non-governmental organizations and so on, or even private organization. How is it going to impact the life of common man? Because until and unless we have that picture in our minds, it's very hard to, sort of concretize and make sense of what is going on.
Shri, let me take a crack at this. One is because DPI is rooted into very essential principles of inclusion and openness. So I think there is a direct impact on somebody else's life. I mean, we've all been seeing the German minister's video, which has been viral in India, that he makes that small payment in the Hubcoms market and is amazed by the agility of it. So there, I think there's enough empirical evidence, although I believe that the monitoring and evaluation will come in some time because DPI is still evolving. So the metrics to monitor, evaluate the impact of digital public infrastructure on societies and economies, it will take some time. But I think the very principles are right in this case, wherein if this were a proprietary software or if this were a proprietary solutions, they were in a sense often exclusionary and not open. So I think principally DPI is the right approach to impact a common man's life. Now, again, I want to take a step back and actually talk about why this is a big deal that what we've done in the last week. It's a significant shift because this is the first significant effort to theorize the concept of digital public infrastructure. Before this, you had mentions in a World Bank report, in a UN report. People were talking about it, but there was no theoretical, empirical evidence of concretizing this as a concept. So this is massive in terms of that. We've actually, to develop a consensus on the understanding and application of DPI has been achieved with the G20 countries, which is massive because G20 is 2/3 of the world population, 85% of the world's GDP. And one more thing, and the lawyer in you will be ecstatic about it, and Keyzom's already mentioned, but historically DPI was viewed as a tech system. It was something which was developed in Bangalore or by a community of tech developers that, hey, this is a tech solution to physical world problem. But what the Indian presidency has been able to achieve is bring the governance element at the center of things. So to highlight the significant role of governance within it, I think it will spark a lot of discussions, a lot of new ways to look at how DPIs can be governed. Because initially we had thought that the India stack or the India model, and I'm going to dig into your second question as well about the terminologies, but initially we had thought that the Indian model could sail through. But now that we come out of it, it is more tech neutral, but the governance needs to be the focus of it because countries can make it. A MasterCard can make an open protocol payment system, which has happened in Thailand, the Prompt Pay, or French Connect, which is the ID system in France. So you could be, a public entity could be doing it or a private entity could be doing it. But if the guardrails are set by a public authority or the governance, the rules of the game are set by a public authority, to bring that conversation into the center, I think that is a massive achievement of the Indian presidency. The third is that DPI has been collectively endorsed by the countries as a key accelerator for sustainable development goals. Now it's the job of, so 20 countries, 20 digital ministries coming and doing it is really consequential. Now it's the job of the World Banks and the UN to paint the skies with DPI, build IDs, payments, data sharing left, right, center. And I think one more thing which we haven't discussed as yet, but I'm still going to drop the ball, with saying that countries agreeing, because the Indian presidency is also looked as a beacon of hope within the global south. So the countries agreeing for a coordinated financing mechanisms, country agreeing for building DPIs low and middle income countries, that is extremely consequential because this is where we see the way to sustainable development goals. And the last is to, again, your question, and we took some time to actually get that language right, that there could be a terminological difference. Countries can refer to it as with different names. So that, perhaps that was one of the things that kept us till 1 a.m. So the catch there is that even before the G20 presidency, Singapore used to call it as digital utility stack. In India, we used to call it the India stack. But we all knew what we were talking about. We all knew that, hey, this is an identification system. Hey, this is a payment system. And then there are data sharing systems. So we all knew that what we're talking about, but there was no globally recognized consensus on what this approach looks like. So as Keyzom just mentioned, that this is a whole of society. The society comes in, the community of developers, the community of think tanks, etc. Everyone joined this bandwagon. So to have this agree with countries. And one more thing, when we started this process, we had three deliverables. One was a framework, one was financing for low middle income countries, and the last was global DPI repository. So when we started this framework, countries were reluctant, hesitant, and then confused as to what is the DPI. Do I have a DPI? Do we don't have a DPI? So they were confused about it. But with these discussions, countries have actually gone back to their countries, engaged with experts and identified their DPIs and have actually talked about it that, hey, we also have a DPI. So I think just in terms of sheer understanding, this is a humongous effort, and to give people a framework. Now, if anyone looks at DPI, they have, okay, it requires tech governance community. The tech needs to be open and interoperable. The governance needs to be in a certain structure where it needs to be in the tech itself. Then there could be a sector specific legislation, and then there could be a broad overarching legislation. And similarly, community, it can only be a DPI if others can build on top of it. As she mentioned, these are public rails. So to go by the classic David Eve examples of, this is a shared means to many ends. This is like a road. You can build a house nearby, you can drive a car, you can drive a truck. This is identification. A bank can use it, a hotel booking can use it, a eKYC for a Forex card can use it. So many other people can ride on top of it and use this infrastructure to provide the goods and services they were historically struggling for. And I don't think we need to talk about all those numbers, that the customer verification cost for per customer has come down drastically in India, and other countries are following suit on it. So I think it's important to recognize that we've brought forth such a key discussion on the center. And now it only goes up from here. It's G20 today, tomorrow it goes to the United Nations. Day after, it goes to, I think there have already been some discussions in the WTO about a DPI approach. Someday it could go to an agriculture forum. So I think it's just G20 has become such a launchpad for this approach that it has catapulted the stature of DPI in the global conversations.
That's fantastic. And like the ministerial declaration also stresses upon three things to begin with, right? So first being identification, which itself is a major challenge. India, of course, has managed to solve it to some extent, but it remains a huge challenge in other low and middle income countries or LMICs. The second being payments. Now, UPI is a success. I think this model is being replicated in similar fashion across the globe. And the third being data sharing with consent. And that is key, right? But having said all this, there's a glaring challenge in front of us. Of course, India would like to export this idea. India would like to maybe even build a DPI for other LMICs. But there are significant challenges when it comes to A, funding, and B, technical assistance. And even the ministerial declaration sort of touches upon these two challenges. And one of the ideas which has come out is One Future Alliance, which is a voluntary initiative that India has initiated discussions upon.
Stay tuned to All Things Policy. We'll be right back after a short commercial break.
So I want to know from you, Keyzom, so how big is the challenge for building DPIs, for technical assistance and funding in these LMICs? And what is your take on this One Future Alliance? Does the future look bright for it? Or how is this problem going to be solved in the coming years and decades?
Wow, that's a great question. I do want to add that, in addition to what Ritul mentioned, the Pacific Island ICT and digital ministers are meeting in a couple of days. And digital public infrastructure is top of the agenda in their discussions, along with, of course, a number of other issues. Now, you asked, what does it mean for a common person? What does it mean for a country? That is our lowest common denominator, and also the place where we have the greatest impact for DPI's change and potential. And the struggle is more, figuring out how does DPI interact with existing systems? What is the role that it will play on as part of existing infrastructure, whether it's health systems and so on? And I think those are kind of things that we'll need to unpack at the country level through technical assistance. Second is also trying to understand what is DPI vis-a-vis AI models or upcoming data commons and data protection and so on. So helping sense make of this positioning or the situating digital public infrastructure in the country context becomes extremely important to articulate. And that is exactly where the aspiration of the One Future Alliance sits vis-a-vis the proposal that has been introduced by the India presidency with support from its knowledge partners such as the UNDP and the World Bank and others, is really about kind of, beyond sort of the panoply of existing global initiatives or regional initiatives or supply-driven technologies and support and so on. What is that country centricity approach where you still need to build those foundational capabilities, whether it's your procurement strategy, whether it's kind of embedding some common minimums across various government departments in terms of their technologies that they are building or buying or strengthening and so on, whether it's unifying governance, data governance and AI governance and digital governance. All of that ultimately has to result in better accountability and better redressal mechanisms for people. So I think this is where the focus of the One Future Alliance remains, to really kind of be this new institution or new initiative. The model is very agile in terms of its network of partnerships and affiliates that it will aim to leverage across the globe. But it's really to build those foundational capabilities so that the DPI advantage can be realized in a short span of time and across sectors. Now, we talked about ID data exchanges and payment systems. Even if you look at it in the India context, it's barely scratched the surface vis-a-vis climate change, vis-a-vis access to justice, vis-a-vis access to health, right? So I feel, and this is my belief, especially from the UN side, is that there is sort of the new horizons that we need to open up on digital public infrastructure as we build out this new class of infrastructure that can create sort of, common sort of rails for also helping achieve our climate goals as, 130 plus countries or 150 plus countries that sign up across various, global accords and campaigns and so on, and are collecting a lot of data. Secondly, we see that, data collection efforts or even systems-based efforts are being done in a duplicative manner in environment, in justice. And those are, I think, places where we need to really kind of see more effort and understanding, because DPI as an idea may be now sort of simple to explain or even understand with this consensus, but how it manifests at the country level and creates that change is where I think we have the biggest role to play through the One Future Alliance, with India's leadership and the multi-stakeholder participation of interested countries and stakeholders in this huge effort.
Thanks for that, Keyzom. Thanks for that explanation. Ritul, you also mentioned something called the Global Digital Public Infrastructure Repository, or GDPIR, right, which India plans to build. Could you maybe discuss it a little bit more and tell us what it is going to look like, what India plans to do with this, and how is it going to play out?
Thanks, Shri. I've spent countless hours thinking about it, so I think I can take a crack at it.
Maybe you can summarize it for us.
Yes, definitely. So the idea was that when we started looking for digital public infrastructure, we had no central data place to go about it. We have to actually either speak to countries, which we did in a lot of cases. We spoke to Bangladesh, we spoke to Philippines, we spoke to the Brazilians. So we had no central data place, or we had to reach out to our friends in the UN and the World Bank to actually help us identify what these are. However, there are certain repositories, such as the Digital Public Goods Alliance or the DIAL repository, as well as the GovStack repositories. But these are mainly focused from the tech perspective. The Digital Public Goods Alliance repository is a collection of open source solutions that are available to adopt. There are certain DPGs that can translate into DPIs, but there are also other open source solutions. So DPG is just a component into DPI. A DPI can use a DPG. A DPI can also not use a DPG. So it's just a cog in the larger scheme of things. So while we were doing our research, we felt a drastic need for a repository that can house solutions, and also a lot of the places where these information are. I think one of the website is the biometric.com or something. The problem is that these solutions there are from secondhand information. So they are taken with researchers, consultants, etc. So there is no concrete information from the designated government entities, ministries. So for anyone, if it is a researcher or if it is a policymaker, there wasn't a clear description or a clear place to find what DPIs are across globally, what standards are they using, what is the governance mechanism they're using, what kind of community participation exists in these digital public infrastructure. So with that knowledge gap that was existing, it was our intent to build a repository where we can house different DPIs. And thankfully, we had overwhelming support of countries in doing so. We are in the process of building it, and it will be launched sometime soon. And it's going to solve the basic problem of exploration. So when you look at DPI, and particularly from a repository point of view, there are two things. One is adoption, the other is exploration. The adoption bit is there. The adoption bit lies in the GovStack, the DPGAs on the dial, where you can actually see the tech solution that is available for developers to open and build upon. But it's not useful to let's say low middle income countries, or even to someone who wants to write a paper, because that approach of just adoption based repository can only be understood by a certain amount of technical expertise, etc., all those information. Whereas what we are aiming to solve here is the problem of exploration, the problem of identification that, hey, these are the kind of different solutions that exist. So that was the intent, that was the broad intent why this deliverable was so important for us. And as you see, when we started, countries were reluctant towards the term DPI initially. And now we've come to a point where in the current scenario, countries are actively recognizing, identifying their own DPIs. So many, I think 8 odd countries have actually shared their DPIs with us. We are in the process of collecting and putting that information together. We have a collation of 25 plus digital public infrastructure from so many other G20 countries. So I think just in that sense, we see so much excitement around showcasing their digital public infrastructure. And to the extent that with nitty-gritties, such as what payment standards are using, what is the ID standard that they're using. So that was the broad idea and the intent and the intended impact for GDPI here.
I can't help but play a little bit of a devil's advocate here, because when we are talking about DPIs, these are essentially large-scale data systems which harvest citizens' data at a scale which is not possible otherwise. And this gives rise to obvious privacy risks and privacy concerns, data security concerns, and so on. And not all regimes in the world are democratic or ensure democratic rights when it comes to privacy of citizens' data. So I want to know from you, is there a possibility that endorsement of DPI, say by India or G20, might actually aid certain countries in setting up, say, reverse engineering the DPI to create large-scale surveillance networks, which actually ends up harming the human rights of people over there rather than enabling them? So is there a risk like that? Of course, the framework does mention privacy and security as one of the core principles. Governance is embedded in DPI, but ultimately it's an optional framework because every country is free to adapt it to its own needs. So what is sort of your take on the issue that I just pointed out?
Thank you for asking. This is exactly why, from the UN side, digital public infrastructure is a huge priority, both from its potential to accelerate our global goals, the Sustainable Development Goals, by 2x, 100x. But at the same time, or on the other hand, being implemented in such a way that it doesn't have the right guardrails, safeguards, governance frameworks, that it may actually end up being surveillance tools, be sort of exclusionary to certain population segments or minorities. And therefore, we believe that, the universality of safeguards across digital public infrastructure is extremely important. India wholeheartedly agrees with us, which is why we were invited also to join from the UN side as a knowledge partner on digital public infrastructure, because that was one of the critical common understanding that we needed to achieve under the leadership of the India presidency with the rest of the G20. So those threats are there. Absolutely, I see it day in, day out across many of the 130 or even let's say 173 member states and territories in which UNDP works. But the potential of it being misused is certainly not a good enough reason for its ability to accelerate, for not taking action to make this potential to accelerate the SDGs possible. So I think, we really have to work together, take a whole of society approach, make sure there's a very strong participation of the community. And this is where also we saw a very strong emphasis under the Indian presidency's leadership in the G20.
Right. So before we close, just a quick question, and I want to hear thoughts from both of you on this. So what next for DPI? Of course, with G20, we still have the leadership summit happening next month, so we'll hold the horses on that one. But generally to speak, at a multilateral level, of course, there are potential immense possibilities, right? But apart from that, I want to know from you, what next for DPI in terms of concrete outcomes that we can expect in the next, say, half a decade or so?
Shri, just before we move to the next one, I want to answer the previous one. The threats that you mentioned are shared by many, many, many people around the world. And as Keyzom rightly mentioned, the involvement of UN and so many other entities is with considering those threats, that even with the threats, this has so much transformative potential. But I need to highlight here one critical point is that this recognition, this endorsement of digital public infrastructure becomes critical because this is taking into account the threats. We had the European bloc in the House, who is so concerned about all the threats that you just mentioned, who has privacy and human centricity at the very basis of every tech or socio-economic solutions that they're thinking about. So if 20 countries and the ones that think like you are on board with it, that's a massive achievement, and that's a massive endorsement for an approach like this. So I think when we bake it into, and one is when we bring these conversations to the center, the conversations around privacy, security, data protection also take some space. So, and two is when we bring so many diverse stakeholders and make it a global agenda, it invariably involves that tomorrow you will see principles for ID, tomorrow you will see principles for payment that safeguards individual at the center of things. While all of this surveillance, a lot of these things were already happening, but now that the conversation in center, people are actually thinking, how can they make their payment system more robust? How can they make their ID system more robust? How can they adopt a model where decentralized data collection happens, where security is baked into the technological architecture, but that's not enough. How do you actually make governance rules, governance regulation, laws, etc., which keep, regardless of the benefits of what DPI provides, which keep the individual at the center of this large scheme of things. So I think it's important that we've got an endorsement from countries who are so passionate about it. So that means there's a massive endorsement to the approach. And now with their participation into it, this will invariably become a global agenda with privacy and other safeguards built into it.
So in terms of what's next, I think, the G20 India presidency theme, Vasudeva Kutumbakam, remains true and will be carried forward. For many of our listeners, it means this world is my family or one family. And indeed, that is how this presidency has really sort of taken forward some of its flagship agendas. And we hope that the One Future Alliance will do many great things. We know that digital public infrastructure as a new and emerging class of infrastructure will remain important, and we'll see lots of actions across all the SDGs. I do invite our listeners to read the Digital Public Infrastructure and Sustainable Development Goals Compendium that was launched under the India presidency with the United Development Programme, as well as the DPI playbook. So I can send you all those links shortly. Thank you for having me.
Sure. And I'll make sure to plug those links in our show notes today. Ritul, any closing thoughts from your side?
No, just quite a few that I think in terms of what's next, now that we've gotten it so far, it's the job of the multilaterals, the One Future Alliance to actually take this agenda, hit the road and actually start implementing, working towards those sustainable goals that are intended to achieve. And the Compendium is an excellent resource to actually help you identify that each digital public infrastructure, how it can be mapped or how it can help in attainment of a particular sustainable development goal. So one which is end poverty is directly linked to government providing benefits to the citizens, or identification of your citizens, so that tomorrow there's a refugee crisis, you still have identification, so you could still provide benefits to your citizens and not leave them astray. So that's one critical aspect of it. Other than that, I believe that it will immensely benefit a lot of stakeholders in this broad ecosystem. The technology companies that are providing assistance in this, I think they are to gain incredibly. As the UN and the World Bank will build, they will seek assistance from so many technology countries globally. The equipment manufacturer, the biometrics, etc. So I think there is a lot that needs to come for everybody in this ecosystem. The think tanks are going to extensively write about the governance around it. The tech, the community, the developers, I think, and particularly the startups. I mean, look at how the startup ecosystem has boomed in India. So I think you will see a lot of mushrooming of startups globally who will build solutions on top of public infrastructure. And finally, personally for me, I think as the fellowship comes to an end, please make some space at Takshashila so that I can come back.
Sure, definitely. And when you talk of developers community or the technological companies or startups, I'm sure all our listeners in Bangalore would be very happy to hear that, because I'm sure Bangalore is going to be spearheading DPI in the years to come. Anyway, thank you for joining me for this excellent conversation on DPI and G20. Thanks, Keyzom. Thanks, Ritul. And hope to have you back again.
Thanks, Shri. Always a pleasure to be at Takshashila.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @Takshashila INST or our website takshashila.org.in.